Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be having an inside view from a Christian journalist who's been living in Israel for the past 2 decades with an insight and understanding of some of the threats and the challenges facing Israel. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from Israel, but originally from the United States, Cheryl Hancock. Warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. And Cheryl, you have been based in Israel as a Christian journalist for the past 2 decades, but before we discuss what it's like to be working, living in Israel, to actually understanding the current events that are shaping Israel and the Middle East, would you share with us how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and something about your background of growing up in the States?
Yeah, well, for 19 years, I was a drug addict. I was a drug dealer, and I was arrested quite a few times, and I was in jail. A lot went wrong in my life, but I kept getting out and going on with what I was doing and selling the drugs. And I was even a heroin addict for 2 years. And I had to get myself off of that after I got arrested. And so I came down in jail, and it was very difficult. I knew that there was something more to life. I always knew there was a God, but I didn't know who he was. And I kept reaching out for God, but I didn't know how to find him. One morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, I knew I was loaded out of my mind, and I decided I needed God in my life. So I dropped to my knees, and I reached up my hands. I said, if you're real, then help me, because I didn't know what else to do. I felt like I was up in quicksand up to here, and if I would have kept going, I would have drowned. And I knew I was on the way out. Well, I passed out that night. The next day, I still wanted to be straight. I wanted a new life. And so I called up a hospital. I went into a 28-day in-house drug program where I took a Bible somebody had recently given me, and I began reading the Bible. And as I was reading it, I saw this verse that said, I will take you from the miry clay and set your feet on a rock. And I went, that was to me. He took me from the quicksand, he put my feet on a rock, and he began washing me off. All that stuff, all those things I did, horrible things to people, even to my family, running away from home at 15 years old. And all the horrible things, he washed me off, and I started a new life. I began to read the Bible, and I realized that he died for me. The Lord died for me, and I said, you died for me, so I want to live for you. And I didn't go to church. I didn't think I was good enough to go to church. I was a biker, Harley Davidsons. I was hitting up drugs and all this stuff, and I wasn't good enough. And so I was just at home reading the Bible and praying. And it was the Lord that kept giving me the scripture and kept pulling me out. And suddenly I got a job, and then a better job. And I ended up working at a nuclear power plant as a security officer, but they wouldn't give me a gun in the beginning because they didn't trust me. They knew my background. And after a while, they began to trust me. My life really did change. The Lord changed it, verse by verse, scriptures. I had gone to a church, and I confessed that Jesus was my Lord, and then got baptized, and my life just rocketed from there. I became an armed security officer. And after that, I decided I wanted to go to Israel, to go to that place that I read so much about in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. It was, my gosh, I want to go see these places. And I went for a once-in-a-lifetime trip, and I knew it wasn't enough. And I went back, and I was offered a position in Jerusalem.
Amazing. And so, I mean, you've had an absolutely incredible salvation story there, Cheryl, which is absolutely remarkable. But what was it about Israel that the Lord kept drawing you back and giving you a love for this land and its people?
It was because he was there. He loved the land. That's where he came from. He loved those people. He called them his chosen people. And really, when I went to Israel, I thought I'd be working among the Jews. And when I got there, the Lord had brought Muslim and Arabs, Arab Christians and Muslims and Arab Christians in front of my path. And shame on me if I wouldn't work with them, but I had a prejudice against the Arabs. And the Lord had to work on that prejudice, because how can I love all people equally as the Lord does if I have a prejudice? So that's why he kept bringing the Arabs in front of me. And I worked with the Arabs for 17 years, and I grew a love for the Arab people, because it's all about them and the Lord's love, and they want his love so bad. And when I could tell them about his love, they wanted to beat him, and they wanted to become a believer.
Excellent. And can you share with us how you got involved in journalism and wanting to report the news from Israel, which is the best place to be, really, to come and report the news?
Absolutely. The two things I wanted to be: when I ran away from home at 15, I left school. I went back and got my GED, but it wasn't enough to become a journalist. But I wanted to be a journalist or an archaeologist. And what happened was, I was there, and Voice of Hope Radio in the year 2000, Hezbollah came and took over the military zone there, and the radio towers were up. So they asked me, they hired me to come on and do PR work to move the radio station to Jerusalem, from Lebanon to Jerusalem. And they said, by the way, can you interview people and this and that? And I had a blast doing it, because that's what I've always wanted to do. And sure enough, I got to be a journalist in, as you said, the best place in the world to be a journalist.
Definitely. Yeah. So can you share with us some of the highs and some of the lows over the past 20 years of covering some of the big political news stories and events in Israel? Because you've seen it all. I mean, you've been there during the start of the second Intifada with all the suicide bombings and all the terrorism. You've been there when Netanyahu was re-elected as Prime Minister for a second time back in 2009. Still Israel's Prime Minister, but for how long we don't know. But some major events that you've actually been in Israel.
Yeah. I was able to go to the Likud headquarters and see him become prime minister. We waited there till 1 o'clock in the morning. The votes were coming in, the excitement raged. I mean, I got there at probably 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and everyone was excited. It was amazing to see him come out on the platform that he finally won as prime minister. And I was a Likudnik. I wanted him to win at that point, and I'm so glad he did. A lot of Christian journalists were there. I've got to meet a lot of them and work alongside a lot of them also. It was a high point because of that. There were times when I was attacked. I had a hand grenade in my backyard. Somebody pulled the pin of the hand grenade and they threw it at a gas tank that feeds the stoves to the apartments. So if that hand grenade would have went off, all of us probably would have died from that. And it was live and it didn't go off. And the next morning, bomb squad came out. When a kid found the hand grenade, didn't touch it, and the bomb squad came out and blew it up in a field. There was a pipe bomb in my carport. It went off, and I felt the compression, of the explosion. And I thought, 911, I'll call 911. That's what we do in America, 911. There is no 911 in Israel. I don't even know what the number is. So I went to bed. Forget it, I'll go to sleep. And then I had a goat sit in my driveway. Somebody was trying to put a curse on me because they found out I was a Christian and believed that I was going to be a missionary and steal the souls of the Jews and turn them into Christians, and thus wiping out the Jewish people. And so they put a goat's head in my driveway. I rode over it, and of course I got a picture of it. And this is something that they do to put curses on people. It's called Kabbalah. So there was a lot of things that happened to me. I was driving down the street, and a rock about this big, Palestinian was up on the cliff, and he threw the rock at my car. He tried to get it through my windshield and hit my headlight instead. So it was very close. So I've had a lot of close calls, and my life was threatened. People were telling me they were going to come and kill me, and I didn't know if they knew where I lived or what. And then I made a decision. Am I going to be terrorized by these people and give in to them and stop doing what I'm doing, stop getting the truth out, or not? And so I decided not to be terrorized, which most Israelis decide. They're going to live their lives the way they're going to live it and not be terrorized and go along. And I just kept giving the news out, doing what is the truth. The truth needs to come out about Israel. And that's part of what I do, is bring out the truth.
Excellent. Oh, and Cheryl, what have you learned in the past 20 years of being in Israel? What was the Lord showing you about his land and his people that we can all take something away from?
Well, they truly are a stiff-necked people. And that's also in the Bible, and they will tell you that. The Jewish people want to get to know you before they believe what you're saying. So it makes sense. And probably your neighbors want to get to know you before they believe what you're saying. So you just don't go in there and start telling them what you believe and telling them you're right and they're wrong. And so I got to meet the people close up. I have friends that are 20 years, and I've been there 21 years now. And I mean, the relationships I have are close. I've seen kids being born, and then when they're 3 years old, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, they get their hair cut for the first time, and every member of the household gets a scissors and does a cut, and they handed me the scissors, which was an honor for me to be able to be a part of it. Then I saw this boy also have his bar mitzvah, and then he got married, and I was able to give him some furniture and things to help him get married. But I lived alongside these people, the Jewish people. I actually helped a lot of the Arab people, and the Arab people, I had a distribution center for a long time, because you go out to get the story of what's going on in their lives, and you find out there's a lot more going on than you know, and these people need help. And so I would take them clothes and food and whatever it is they need, the kids' things. But you know what they wanted to tell me, a lot of the Arab people? They said, will you please tell our stories to the West? Because how we're treated, and these were the so-called the Palestinians, we're treated under our governments is horrible, and we've been tortured. And if we say the wrong thing, our family can be hurt. We can be killed. If we don't go out and throw rocks or have our kids throw rocks, we can be hurt. And so what they're living under is they're being kept poor. And so a lot of the kids become Fatah or they become Hamas because that's the only way to make money. And they end up being martyrs because they're taught that's good, that's being a hero for your country. And none of the leaders, kids, do that. They go to London, they go to America, they learn how to be doctors and lawyers. And these people want the same for their kids, but they don't have that chance. And they want out. A lot of the people want out. So it's not all the people that are fanatics and that want to attack Israel. It's because they're coerced. One guy sat across from me and said, Cheryl, I think I'm going to blow myself up. And I said, what do you mean you're going to blow yourself up? He said, well, I'm a teacher in the West Bank, and Hamas told me I can never be a teacher again because I wouldn't let them come in my classroom. He said, how am I going to support my family? If I blow myself up and I kill some Jews, then they will get money the rest of their lives. They'll be taken care of. So some people attack Jewish people so that they can get money for their family and for themselves.
Extraordinary.
It's horrible.
Absolutely horrific. And these stories need to come out more and more brave and courageous Palestinians need to get in front of the TV screen to tell that story. But obviously they're concerned about the threat of their life and the threat of their family's life. But they need to show more bravery in order to expose the real truth that's going on with the Palestinian Authority. Now, living in Israel, you would have lived through those last 21 years, the Second Intifada, which was horrendous. And having visited Israel during that period, it was a scary time, particularly to be in Jerusalem. And you didn't know if one coffee shop would get blown up, or could you get on board this particular bus? Could you walk down this particular street? And I remember going in 2001 and 2002, and hardly anyone would walk down the centre of Jerusalem. Not like today, thankfully. And then you've also lived through Israel's war against Hezbollah in 2006 with the rockets and missiles. What was that like to be in Israel, knowing that Israel's under that constant rocket and missile attack?
You know, it's amazing because during the Intifada, the night that it happened, Ariel Sharon went up to the Temple Mount. I remember I was staying in a friend's place because I had just left Christian Friends of Israel, where I worked for a year, and I had an apartment, and I was in between apartments, and he was gone, so he let me stay in his house. He had one of those storefront things where you ring down the metal. And when I heard what was going on, they told everyone to close your doors, stay inside, because there was rioting in the streets. And I was so glad I had that metal covering to be able to stay inside. I didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know if you were even sitting next to a bus if it was going to blow up. It was very scary times. And then there was a double suicide bombing on Ben Yehuda Street, and I had friends on Ben Yehuda Street that had stores. And I walked into my friend's store the day after, and they're cleaning it up, and I was in tears. I looked at them, they looked at me, they were in tears. I didn't need to say a word. and I walked out. They knew that I cared for them, and that's all it took. But what they were going to do, and what the Israelis do, is they clean up as quickly as possible, get life going back as normal as possible, and keep on going. So that's what it was like during the Intifada. With the rockets coming in, a different story. I mean, I would go down to the Gaza Strip area. I wouldn't go inside of Gaza. I would go to Sderot, which is 1 mile away from the Gaza Strip. And one time I went with a friend, and I was in my car. And I had just bought a new car because someone stole my old car. So I'm in this new car, and we have to roll down the windows because the sirens would go off. And when the red alert goes off, you want to get cover. And so we heard the red alert, and my friend said, "Get out of the car." I said, "We're in the middle of the street. Get out of the car now. Stop the car." And so I left it in the middle of the street. We got out, and we went behind a wall, and the rocket went over our heads. And I went, "Oh my gosh. I'm getting it." And so then we went into a coffee shop, and we were watching what had just happened on the TV, and we're going, "Oh my gosh." And all of a sudden the red alert went off again. So this time I took my coat and my coffee and ran behind a wall. You start understanding what you're going to need. I mean, I was behind the wall freezing when the rockets were coming. I didn't know what to do. And you don't wait till just one rocket goes off. There could be another one and another one. And so there were so many times that the rockets went off and I had to run to a bomb shelter. When you go grocery shopping, you better know where the bomb shelter is, because if the siren goes off, you've got to run to it. I have a bomb shelter in my apartment, and I slept in that for 2 weeks because the rockets kept coming in, and you never knew when you had to run to the bomb shelter.
And how have you been able to portray this to those who read your news reports, Cheryl, particularly to an American audience?
Well, we do a lot of writing. We do articles. We do radio interviews. We do interviews for stations that want to call us and talk, even during wartime or something happens. And then I will answer questions, interviewing, and people will call in and ask me questions. I also speak all over. I speak in schools. I'll speak in churches. We speak wherever we're invited, to anyone who wants to know what's going on. And what's good about going to places, let's say I'm in a church on a Sunday, and they say, "Oh, there's somebody from Israel coming to talk," and they don't know what I'm going to be talking about, and I start telling them what's actually going on in Israel, they can't believe it. Their mind is just, and then they want more information. And so now we have so many invitations to speak in so many different places, we can't get to them all. It's hard, and I'm getting older, and it's slowing down, but so many more people want to know, and they need to know, because Israel is treated unfairly in the media. As my husband puts it, we're in a media war, and Israel needs Hasbara, or they need PR. They need somebody to say, "Hey, that's not true, that's a lie," and that's what we try to do. There's others that try to do it, but not enough. Not enough. People really don't know what's going on in Israel. And I love both people. So I can't say I'm pro-Israel. I can't say I'm pro-Palestinian. I'm pro the Lord. And I think we should love all people. And that's what I try to portray.
Absolutely. So we're currently in Israel. You're not in Israel at the moment, obviously. But the threats that Israel face are pretty dire, aren't they, at the moment? The fact is that Hezbollah in the north have something like 160 to 180,000 rockets and missiles that have the potential to reach all over Israel. In Syria, with the ongoing civil war, there's 80,000 Iranian troops and militias under Iran's control, just 50 miles from Israel's border. The situation in Gaza as well. Could Israel face, in a new war, a kind of multi-front war?
Yes, they could, and they're expecting it. As a matter of fact, they're practicing for it. And so what we're looking at is Hezbollah, of course, is working with Syria. Syria's working with Iran, and even Iraq is Shiite. They're all working together. And Iran also has military bases in Iraq, in the desert out there. So as they work together and they bring in weapons, and you'll hear about, oh, Israel bombed a convoy. Oh, why did they do that? Well, that answer is not on the television. It's just that they bombed a convoy because they were taking weapons to Hezbollah, to Lebanon, southern Lebanon, which is on the border of Israel, and they can fire those weapons into Israel. And now what was the latest scoop, and I don't know if it's true or not, I need to look into it, is that they're trying to get a weapon with GPS on it so that they can say, okay, send this one to the Knesset, send this one to a synagogue, send this one to, and if they can do that, if they can actually, but right now it's just wild. It just goes where it goes. And so, yes, all-front war, even Hamas could fire at the same time. Israel is trying to get ready for that. Yeah.
So let's have a look now at some of the strategic threats that Israel face and why we've got to continue our prayer support for Israel.
The Middle East is imploding. In the past few years, there have been violent revolutions, military escalations, and armed conflicts in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and more. Iranian proxies are undermining regimes as conventional armies are losing ground to terrorist groups like Hezbollah and ISIS, resulting in the crumbling of Arab states. Some have argued that this turmoil has enhanced Israel's security. The disintegration of the Syrian and Iraqi armies, which used to pose a major threat, and the peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt now enable Israel to make territorial concessions, they contend. Is Israel really in a position to make concessions on its borders?
The Western Israel must now prepare to defend themselves against a new kind of enemy. The terrorist groups gaining power in the Middle East today are not like those of the past, comprised of small, secretive cells carrying out hijackings, shootings and suicide bombings. We're now confronting terror armies. The British Army faced this threat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Israel is facing these threats along all of its borders. That's why strategic depth as a key to defensible borders is still crucial as a first line of defense.
Hamas in Gaza has evolved from an underground terrorist group into the ruling regime and a formidable military force. With army bases, former lines of command, fighting brigades, special forces, including naval commandos, offensive tunnels, thousands of rockets, anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. The same goes for ISIS and Hezbollah, who have armored vehicles, advanced artillery, missiles, drones, and more. Hezbollah, which is deployed along Israel's northern borders, has already threatened to invade the Galilee in the next war. All of that is a proof of the importance of having defensible borders.
While some of these terror groups may fight each other, they still share the common objective of destroying Israel. They flaunt violations of accepted humanitarian norms that oblige all those involved in armed conflict. Another prominent force which has taken advantage of the Middle East turmoil is Iran.
In Iran's attempt to achieve regional supremacy, the Islamic Republic has financed, armed, and mobilized expeditionary forces to topple governments, seize territories, and tighten their imperial grip across the Middle East. We're witnessing this Iranian-backed expansion in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and in other places. And these forces are currently encircling Israel. Once Iran becomes a nuclear threshold state, the escalation of terrorism against Israel will only rise.
Iran supplies Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah with advanced rockets, weaponry, and know-how. Once it becomes a nuclear threshold state, Tehran will be able to back Hezbollah and other Shiite militias with complete impunity, as countries would hesitate to retaliate in fear such actions may escalate into a nuclear war. In addition, we cannot rule out the options of Iran transferring nuclear technology to its Middle East proxies.
Since 1967, the Jordan Valley has served as a formidable geographic barrier, protecting Israel's narrow 40-mile waistline from the east. These steep slopes, which are controlled by Israel, create a 4,000-foot-high geographic barrier which is difficult to penetrate.
This ridge that we see here is a topographical obstacle between the Jordan Valley and the main center of Israel. And as you can see, it's very hard to cross it with a big orbit or big formation of tanks, etc. And there are only 5 passages, so it's easy to defend. And the area is wide open, so you can deploy here 2 divisions once it's needed. And in our region, it's needed every some every couple of years. We need this defensive border, the Jordan Valley, because it gives us, first of all, a minimal strategic depth of only 40 miles between here and the Israeli seashore. It gives us a decent way to protect ourselves if there will be an attack from the outside, and it gives us also the ability to fight terrorism effectively. If Israel don't control this area, the Iranians will just enter it in the same way that they enter South Lebanon, the same way that they provide help to the Hamas in Gaza.
Infiltrators could then easily reach the western slopes of the mountain ridge which overlook Israel's entire coast. The large population centers around Tel Aviv and Haifa, strategic industries and military facilities. Israel's main transportation arteries and only international airport Ben Gurion would become easy targets. Given this background, it is easy to understand why the vast majority of Israeli security authorities have strongly opposed concessions in the Jordan Valley. Moving up north along the Jordan Valley, we reach Mount Hermon and the Golan Heights, from which Israel can watch the Syrian civil war unfold. Prior to the 1967 war, this kibbutz, like many other Israeli villages and towns, was bombed and shelled on a regular basis by Syrian army forces deployed on this elevated area overlooking the Sea of Galilee.
All the arguments from the last 25 years that said Israel could safely withdraw from the Golan Heights have been exposed as based on false premises. Had Israel withdrawn from the Golan, we could have easily had ISIS and Al-Qaeda bearing down on the Sea of Galilee and northern Israel.
Iran is also making gains on the Syrian border in the Golan in order to turn it into a base for attacks against Israel as part of its national security doctrine that sees value in engaging Israel in constant conflict. Senior Iranian and Hezbollah officers were recently targeted, allegedly, by Israel as they made their plans on the Syrian border.
Therefore, retaining the Golan Heights is clearly a vital Israeli security interest.
Even in the day of phenomenal technology, and even any foreseeable technology, does not remove the need to have borders that are defined and that can be defended.
Did anyone predict the Arab Spring? And once it started, did anyone predict it would turn into an exploding chaos? Israel cannot plan its security around a snapshot of the current Middle Eastern political situation. We must ask, what will the region look like tomorrow or a decade from now? We don't know. That's why Israel must assume that its need for defensible borders will always be relevant.
In an unpredictable and constantly shifting Middle East, one factor remains constant. Defensible borders are vital to Israel's security.
And as we saw from that excellent video produced by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, how vital it is that Israel's borders are protected and that Israel has secure borders, knowing that the threats are changing against Israel as the months go on. Cheryl, we saw in that fantastic clip there that really did provide that analysis of the threat that Israel faces from the north to the south, and that's why Israel needs defensible borders. But you've been living in Israel, and there's been a lot of speculation in the Israeli news recently that Israel possibly could face a multi-front war against Iran in Syria, against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and also then fighting against Hezbollah in the same time, which will be horrific if that's the situation. But how is Israel preparing itself for this?
Well, they are, as I said, they are doing some tests right now. They're getting together. They're having, even the hospitals are involved. We have an underground hospital now. Looks like a parking lot, but actually it's underground, has everything that they need. The people are being warned of what's going on. Most people are aware of what's going on. Netanyahu said, if you have a gun, carry it. because there are so many threats in Israel, and there's been knife attacks just about every day, if not every day, every week. It's just constant car rammings and all these things. So Netanyahu told people to take their guns and be ready. But when that happens, the bomb shelters are being cleaned out. Some people use them as storage rooms, right, because there was no war. But now they're being cleaned out and prepared because people know there's something coming up. And they found tunnels coming from Lebanon, from southern Lebanon into Israel, just like you see from Hamas coming into Israel. And they don't use those for nothing. They're going to come in and they're going to attack Israelis from those tunnels. So some of them have been blown up. And so they're finding more and more of them preparing to attack Israel, not just from southern Lebanon, but also from Syria on the Golan Heights. They're seeing that, and they know that Iran has bases very close to the border, and then they see it from Hamas. They're still firing rockets. Rockets came in just recently, last week. So it's an ongoing thing. So Israel is starting to move to the desert to get some preparation down there. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, but yeah.
I'd like to. But before we touch on that, I suppose you have to discuss how precarious the situation was, because back in September there was a Hezbollah anti-tank missile that was fired in an Israeli Jeep that narrowly missed that Jeep carrying 5 Israeli soldiers. Now, the IDF put out a statement saying these soldiers in that Jeep, who were in an area where they shouldn't have been, were very, very lucky that they all survived. But we know there's no such thing as luck when it comes to Israel. There's divine intervention and divine protection. But what it does show is that had that missile hit and killed those 5 Israeli soldiers, we would now be looking at a war situation where Israel would then have launched a war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and now would be in the midst of a full-blown military confrontation, possibly involving Iran in Syria as well. So share with us how fragile the situation is, that anything could flare up at any moment.
Right now, Netanyahu is trying to keep the young people. You know, you join the army as a girl or boy at 18 years old, and they're 18, 19, 20 years old when they go in the army, and these are the kids that would be sent in, let's say, to the Gaza Strip. There was a rocket that came and hit a bus right after it hit the bus, right after a bunch of soldiers just got off. A bunch of 18, 19-year-olds just got off the bus, and the whole bus blew up. They would have all been dead. And so that would have caused a real ruckus, and we would have had to do something about it. Israel would have had to do something about it. Well, thank God that Netanyahu didn't have to call troops, ground troops, to go into the Gaza Strip, because they're just doing this. They're saying, come on and in. They're kind of goading them to come in, and urban warfare is one of the newest units that Israel has right now. So the urban warfare is teaching people how to fight among the houses, because they're using people's homes, they're using the hospitals, they're using schools, and you have to be able to go in and get the bad guy, not the good guy. And that's what they're being taught. And that's what these kids are going to be up against if they go in. So they're trying not to go in. We're very close to having a war with not only Hezbollah, but with Hamas, Syria, all around us.
And Cheryl, can you share with us something about that you're very passionate about, which is a very key development in Israel? And this is the fulfillment of the dreams and aspirations of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, in wanting to develop the Negev desert. So can you share with us how Israel is now developing the Negev?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you're right. Ben-Gurion said, you know, the Negev needs to be built, and then the Israelis will be prosperous. And his kibbutz is in Sde Boker, which is in the Negev desert. So he predicted this a long time ago. This is what needs to be done. And now Israel knows that they have to have, that's 60% of Israel is that desert. So where we are living, it was desert. In the 1980s, Ma'ale Adumim was completely desert. Israel started building there. And it's a beautiful community with flowers and trees and water and green grass. And they can make the desert bloom. So they're going to take that all the way down. But they are also building an airport. And the airport is called, there's 2 names, Timna Airport or Ramon Airport. And it's also an airport that's going to be a little bit more protected than Ben-Gurion Airport. So Ben-Gurion is the only international airport right now. So it's the only way to go in and out. If there's a war, Now we have one down in the south. And this is one's protected where it has higher walls around it, and it's protected in different ways. And it's going to be in use very soon. Also, there's a military base near Dimona. In that military base, it's an Air Force base. Inside that military base, you have a United States Army base for the first time ever. The United States has Army bases all over Germany. I lived there. I was an Army brat. I lived on those bases. Now there's one in Israel. And this is bringing the soldiers down. The soldiers are bringing their wives down. The wives are bringing the children. And there's schools, and there's hospitals, and there's councils, municipalities. There's all kinds of things going on in the desert now, and they want to build it up to be just like the rest of Israel. And it's at that beginning stage. And they're going further ahead than what we know. They're even further. I was down there 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and I was talking to a kid. It was called a student village, and I said, well, why are you living here? He said, well, I was going to Beersheba University, but the government wants us to stay down here because they want to populate the Negev. And so they're giving us almost free housing. They still have to pay something for it, but really good housing. There are ministries going in there. There's guest houses going in there. There's housing areas going in there. There's many, many things being developed there, and you have to go there to find out. And the one thing that really amazed me was going to the Sinai desert. There's a border between Sinai and Egypt, and the security officer took us around, driving us around Barnesh Kadeh. Anyways, the name of the place escapes me. But anyways, there's a fence that goes all the way down to Gaza, all the way down to Eilat. So you have this fence. It's a smart fence, and it goes the whole lot of Israel. So if anyone touches that fence, they know that someone's trying to come in. Egypt is on the other side of that fence, and it's their job to shoot. If, say, ISIS or anyone else is trying to come in, then there's a second fence. So they have another couple minutes before they can get to the next fence. Then there's another fence, another couple minutes. It's a warning that these people are coming in, trying to come into Israel and kill the people there. So this town that's on the border is actually they've all been trained in the Army, and they've taken extra basic training so that they can protect their own community. Their children live there, the schools are there. It's a beautiful community. They don't lock their doors during the day. It's safe, but at night is when the terrorists try to come in from the Sinai. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Cheryl. But also, before the program, you talked about how the Sinai, as you just mentioned now, is becoming a new safe haven for ISIS fighters that are fleeing the destruction of the so-called Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Mm-hmm. Why are they all heading towards the Sinai?
Well, the Sinai was called the Wild West for a while there. The Sinai is supposed to be patrolled by Egypt. Israel gave the Sinai to Egypt. Egypt is doing their best to patrol and to take control of any of the Wild West that's down there. We have Al-Qaeda, you name it, different terrorist organizations. But ISIS, that was trying to have their caliphate over there in Syria, in that area, and here now you have the Shiites taken over. So you have Syria, Iran, all the Shiites coming in, and they're Sunni. ISIS is Sunni, so ISIS is leaving, and it's a great place for them to go because it's a huge area, it's a desert, and if they don't get too close to Egypt, one of their fights is with the tribal units of the Bedouin. There's some big tribal units that are dealing drugs that are going back and forth across the border from Egypt to Israel, and they're fighting against the ISIS also because they want to keep their little production going. It's people smuggling and drug smuggling is what's going on. But ISIS is starting to build up, and they say there's thousands of them now, and there is going to be more and more coming as the land is taken over by the Shiites over there in Syria and Iraq and the desert over there.
So let's look at this news report that details how Israeli tourists are fleeing back to the Sinai despite the risks posed by ISIS and other terror organizations.
The Sinai Peninsula is making a comeback as an Israeli tourist destination, despite dire warnings from government security institutes. Boasting a beautiful shoreline in a serene desert background, it is one of Egypt's major tourist attractions and a longtime favorite destination for Israelis. But travel to the peninsula has been discouraged since 2004, when a series of terror attacks killed 34 tourists, 12 of them from Israel. Then the troubles of the Arab Spring began in 2011, followed by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood several years later. Yet Israelis have been returning by the thousands in recent years, even as a new threat has emerged: ISIS. Its growing presence in the Sinai Peninsula is a major concern of Israel's Counterterrorism Bureau, reiterating its long-standing warning at the start of the holiday season. All Israelis in Sinai should leave immediately, and those wishing to travel there should not go. How serious are these travel warnings? Well, they are based on detailed reports gathered by intelligence agencies Mossad and Shin Bet in the target countries, and then evaluated by Israel's top security brass, sometimes going as high up as the IDF chief of staff and even the prime minister.
We need to understand that the travel warning to Sinai, based on real intelligence and very deep assessment about what ISIS can do to the Israeli targets who are traveling along the shore. Therefore, my recommendation was, and still, to take it very seriously. Again, you need to understand it based on intelligence.
Yet the presence of ISIS is limited to the northern part of the peninsula, over 120 miles from the southern resorts, where Egyptian security is ever present. Most Israelis, even those visiting for the first time, say they feel very safe.
I arrived very nervous. I thought after a day I would return home. But it's fun here. There is a great atmosphere and it's very relaxing.
And it's not just the Israelis who are pleased with the changing situation. New resorts are opening on the beach to take advantage of the latest boom. Many local Egyptians insisting it's safe.
I'm really happy because the Israelis came back to Sinai. It's like we are a family. You know, Sinai, it's not really dangerous. Never it will be dangerous, Sinai.
A win-win situation for travelers and locals, at least as long as everyone stays safe. Alec Pollard, I-24 News.
Very interesting news report there, because previously so many Israelis would flock to the Sinai for holiday time. It was also a place where many Western tourists would go as well. But over the last decade or so, very few people have actually dared to go back, despite the beauty and the relaxation offered by the Sinai. Cheryl, now the situation has changed pretty much between Israel and Egypt since General Sisi is in power, and they managed to overthrow the government and the presidency of Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you share with us the cooperation between the Israelis and the Egyptians, particularly as we saw in that news report there about the situation of ISIS fighters finding themselves and using the Sinai as a safe haven?
Yeah, well, it's really been a blessing since Egypt and Israel work together now. And like I said, there's an Egyptian outpost right there. I took a picture of it right across the fence, and they keep people coming into Israel, so they're working closely together. Also, they're working closely together in the Gaza Strip area, because Gaza has been building the tunnels, and Egypt has been filling in those tunnels with seawater. And so actually it's not just Israel trying to get rid of the tunnels, it's Egypt also, but you never hear about that. You never hear about Egypt taking out a whole neighborhood to get rid of tunnels. You only hear about when Israel demolishes a house or here or there. But that's what's been going on. They've been working together to keep that area safe. And the Sinai has been a troubling area. A lot of Egyptian soldiers have been killed by the terrorists that are in there. And so there are more and more Egyptian soldiers going inside. And Israel is beefing up more along that border. But like I said, that border goes from the Gaza Strip to Eilat. And it looked like those people were down a little bit further south of Eilat. And there's, I guess, you know, they feel safe. That's good. It's a beautiful place. It really is on the Sinai. It's warm, it's beautiful, the water's great. But yeah, it's good that they're working together, and it's amazing to see Israel working together, not only with them, but with Jordan, with other countries, Arab countries now, as you know. Yeah.
And Cheryl, can you give us a bit of an insight into the current plight of the Messianic Jewish community in Israel?
Oh my gosh, it has changed so much, in the past 20 years. When I first moved there, I was told not to say that I'm a Christian. I'm just don't say anything about being a Christian because people will come after you and attack you. They'll think that you're trying to steal their soul and all these things. So you had to be very careful about talking to anybody. Now, what's going on is the younger people that have grown up in Israel, that have been born in Israel and have grown up, they are so bold, it's amazing. They have got ministries that are just multiplying like crazy. And I just know of one of them, Hatikva, and they started with helping with dental work for people that don't have any money. And then they opened another clinic in Haifa. Then they opened an adoption clinic somewhere else. And it's just continuing. But the Messianic community is working together. The congregations, there were very few congregations when I first moved to Israel. And they have multiplied many times over. And the amount of Messianic Jews, the believers, are just multiplying like crazy. So it's changed how the believers look at things and do things. So with my generation, it was like, don't say anything, make sure nobody knows anything. And now these people are out doing what they should be doing. And yes, there is problems still with the ultra-Orthodox Jews that don't want them in the country. They say if you become a Christian, then you're no longer Jew and you don't belong in Israel. So it's amazing that they're as bold as they are, but some of them they're in court. Some of them are trying to kick some of them out, which is a bummer right now. And they need prayer. The Messianic community needs prayer.
Yeah, thank you for giving us an update on the situation, Cheryl, as well. Now, speaking about your native country, the United States, with President Trump as US president, who's done more for Israel than any other previous US president. Not only did he recognize Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, but moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He's closed down the PLO diplomatic mission in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He's stopped the funding of the Palestinian Authority. He's pulled the United States out of UNRWA, funding of UNRWA, as well as the UNESCO and the United Nations. He's recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and now he's offered a security pact that if Israel faces an existential threat, i.e. from Iran, then America would come to Israel's defense. But in your own nation, he's not very popular. Why has Israel now become, as it was previously, a non-partisan issue? In other words, Israel had a lot of support amongst the Democrats as well as the Republicans, but now it seems that support for Israel only lies with the Republicans.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is the case?
Well, it's interesting that it has changed because in 1995, they voted that to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And they were supposed to move it. But every 6 months, a waiver would go in front of the president, and he would sign it. No, not the 6 months. Too much trouble going on. No, not the 6 months. All the way from 1995. So Trump didn't have to sign the waiver. I mean, it was already a done deal. And you're right, that was a bipartisan thing. That was Democrats and Republicans doing this. And I think what's going on is because Trump is a friend of Israel, he gets it, he understands what Israel needs and what that means to move the embassy. I think that the Democrats, because Trump is for it, the Democrats are going against it. It's really hard to understand why it's become that way, but it's just turning the Democrats the other way. So Trump is working awful hard to get things done, and things are needing to be done on, let's say, the Golan Heights. And he did mention the Golan Heights is a part of Israel. And if Israel gave away the Golan Heights, their half of the Golan Heights, because Syria's on the Golan Heights also, if they gave that away, then they could shoot right down at the tourists coming to see the Galilee.
And what peace would they get in the meantime when it's an ongoing civil war with no clear outcome?
No.
And to have ISIS or Iranian troops on the Golan Heights would be suicide for Israel.
That's what it would be. So Trump said, of course the Golan Heights belongs to Israel. Of course it does. And that's another thing the Democrats came against. Now, wait a minute. You can't be saying this and that. But, you know, it only makes sense. And if you look at what's going on with Israel, if they don't keep what they have, they're going to get hurt. They're going to get hurt.
So we come to the end of the program now. So it's a very important question. How can our viewers get in touch with you, and how can they get to read about your reports and your radio broadcasts from the Promised Land in Israel?
Yeah, well, I do a monthly report that I send out, and the best way to get a hold of me is by email. And the email address is very easy, one word, reportingfromisrael@gmail.com. Again, that's reportingfromisrael@gmail.com, and you can ask me questions. I can send you the report. And what I do is little paragraphs of news because I don't have time to read a lot of news and details, so I like things short and to the point.
Cheryl, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report, and thank you for giving us your insight and your perspective being in the land. And I pray the Lord will continue to use you powerfully to report the truth from Israel. No better place to be a journalist than being in Israel.
It's a blessing. Thank you so much.
Just want to thank you all for watching today's Middle East Report. We learned about how the Negev is being developed. We learned about the strategic threats that Israel face on her borders, as well as the growing Messianic Jewish community in Israel. And that's why we got to continue to pray and intercede for the nation of Israel, and also to understand the truth from journalists like Cheryl who are based in Israel. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
There is a name I call upon. There is a name by which I am saved. Salvation is your name. Salvation